Marcus Williams walked through the front doors of Roosevelt High School every morning with the same heavy feeling in his stomach. At 15 years old, he had learned to keep his head down and move quickly through the crowded hallways. His large frame made him an easy target, and his dark skin seemed to draw even more unwanted attention from the groups of students who found entertainment in making others miserable. The cafeteria was always the worst part of his day. Marcus would grab his lunch tray and scan the room for an empty table, preferably one far away from the popular kids who seemed to have nothing better to do than point and whisper about him. Today was no different. He found a small table near the windows and sat down carefully, trying not to make his chair squeak against the floor. Tyler Brooks sat 3 tables away with his usual group of followers. Tyler was 17, tall and thin with sharp features, and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through people. He had made Marcus his favorite target since the beginning of the school year, and every day brought some new form of torment. Tyler would wait until Marcus was eating, then make loud comments about how much food was on his plate. His friends would laugh and add their own cruel observations, their voices carrying across the cafeteria for everyone to hear. Marcus tried to eat his sandwich quickly, hoping to finish before Tyler noticed him today. But luck was never on his side at Roosevelt High. He heard Tyler's chair scrape against the floor, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching his table. Marcus kept his eyes down, focusing on his food and trying to pretend he was invisible. Tyler stopped right behind Marcus's chair and placed his hands on the table, leaning down close to Marcus's ear. His voice was low but loud enough for nearby students to hear every word. He made comments about Marcus's size, his appearance, and his eating habits that were designed to humiliate and hurt. Tyler's friends gathered around the table, forming a circle that trapped Marcus in his seat while they took turns adding their own insults. The other students in the cafeteria either watched with uncomfortable expressions or simply ignored what was happening. A few teachers were present, but they were busy with their own conversations and seemed oblivious to the harassment taking place just a few tables away. Marcus had learned long ago that no adult was going to step in and help him. He was on his own in this daily battle for survival. Marcus finished his lunch as quickly as possible and stood up to leave, but Tyler stepped into his path, blocking his exit. The older boy made it clear that Marcus wasn't going anywhere until Tyler decided he was done with his entertainment. Marcus stood there trapped between his chair and Tyler's imposing presence, while the harassment continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. When Tyler finally got bored and walked away with his friends, Marcus gathered his things and headed for his next class. The hallways were just as dangerous as the cafeteria, with students deliberately bumping into him, knocking his books from his hands, or making loud comments as he passed by. Marcus had developed a system for navigating these obstacles, timing his movements to avoid the worst crowds and keeping his belongings held tightly against his chest. His teachers seemed largely unaware of what Marcus was going through outside their classrooms. In class, he was quiet and well-behaved, always completing his assignments on time and never causing any trouble. Most of his teachers probably saw him as a model student, having no idea that he spent every moment between classes dreading the next encounter with his tormentors. The worst part of each day came when Marcus had to use the bathroom. Tyler and his friends had figured out Marcus's schedule and would often wait for him in the hallways near the restrooms. They would block his path, push him against the lockers, or follow him into the bathroom to continue their harassment in private, where no teachers could accidentally witness their behavior. Marcus had tried various strategies to avoid these encounters. He would take different routes to classes, skip using the bathroom during school hours, and even eat his lunch in empty classrooms when he could find them unlocked. But Tyler seemed to have an endless supply of creativity when it came to finding new ways to make Marcus's life miserable. The psychological toll was becoming harder to bear than the physical harassment. Marcus found himself dreading Sunday nights because they meant Monday morning was approaching. He would lie awake in bed, his stomach churning with anxiety about facing another week of humiliation and abuse. His grades began to suffer as his concentration wavered and his confidence crumbled. At home, Marcus tried to hide what was happening from his mother. She worked 2 jobs to support them both and came home exhausted every evening. The last thing she needed was to worry about problems at school that she couldn't fix anyway. Marcus would tell her that school was fine and that he was making friends, lies that came easier with each passing day. But his mother wasn't fooled. She noticed that Marcus had become withdrawn and quiet, spending most of his time in his room instead of watching television or talking about his day. She saw that he was eating less at dinner, claiming he wasn't hungry even though he used to have a healthy appetite. Most concerning of all, she noticed that he seemed afraid to leave the house on weekends, preferring to stay inside rather than go out and enjoy his free time. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Marcus arrived home with a torn shirt and a bruise on his arm that he couldn't explain away as an accident. His mother sat him down at the kitchen table and demanded to know what was really happening at school. Through tears and stammered explanations, Marcus finally told her about Tyler Brooks and the daily torture he was enduring. His mother was furious and wanted to march into the school immediately to confront the principal and demand action. But Marcus begged her not to make a scene, knowing that any adult intervention would only make Tyler angrier and more determined to make his life even worse. They compromised on a plan where she would speak quietly with his guidance counselor about the situation and see if anything could be done discreetly. Marcus went to bed that Friday night feeling both relieved and terrified. He was glad that his mother finally knew the truth, but he was also afraid that Monday would bring even worse treatment when Tyler inevitably found out that adults were now aware of the situation. As he lay in the darkness, Marcus wondered if there was any way out of this nightmare that had become his daily reality. The weekend passed too quickly, and Sunday night arrived with its familiar dread. Marcus stared at the ceiling, knowing that in just a few hours he would have to walk back through those school doors and face whatever new horrors Tyler had planned for him. He had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Marcus's mother, Maria Williams, worked as a nurse at the local hospital during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. She had raised Marcus alone since his father left when he was 8 years old. Maria was a strong woman who had faced many challenges in her life, but seeing her son suffer at school broke her heart in a way that nothing else ever had. On Monday morning, Maria called the school and asked to speak with Mrs. Patterson, Marcus's guidance counselor. She explained the situation carefully, describing the daily harassment her son was facing and how it was affecting his mental health and academic performance. Mrs. Patterson listened with concern and promised to look into the matter, but Maria could hear the tired resignation in her voice that suggested this was not the first such call she had received. Mrs. Patterson called Marcus to her office that afternoon and asked him about the bullying. Marcus spoke quietly about Tyler Brooks and his friends, describing some of the incidents but leaving out the worst details because he was embarrassed and afraid. The counselor took notes and promised to speak with the teachers and administrators about increasing supervision in the hallways and cafeteria. But Marcus knew that adult intervention would only make things worse. Tyler Brooks was smart enough to avoid getting caught by teachers, and he had a talent for making his harassment look like harmless joking around whenever adults were nearby. Marcus had seen other kids try to get help from teachers and administrators, only to face even worse treatment afterward when their tormentors felt they had been betrayed. That same afternoon, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She had been thinking about Marcus's problems all day while working at the hospital, and she remembered something a coworker had mentioned months earlier. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the emergency room physicians, had talked about how her teenage son had gained confidence and lost weight through boxing training at a local gym. After her shift ended, Maria drove to Murphy's boxing gym on the other side of town. The building looked old and run down from the outside, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Murphy's Gym in faded red letters. But when she walked inside, she found a clean, well-organized space filled with boxing equipment and the sound of people working hard to improve themselves. Jimmy Murphy was 62 years old with gray hair and hands that showed the scars of decades of boxing. He had been a professional fighter in his younger days, competing in the middleweight division with moderate success before a shoulder injury ended his career. Instead of becoming bitter about his lost dreams, Jimmy had channeled his love of boxing into training others, particularly young people who needed direction and confidence in their lives. Maria explained Marcus's situation to Jimmy, describing how the bullying was destroying her son's self-esteem and making him afraid to go to school. Jimmy listened carefully, nodding his head as she spoke. He had heard similar stories many times before and understood how boxing training could help young people find their inner strength and confidence. Jimmy explained that boxing was not about teaching kids to fight or solve their problems with violence. Instead, it was about discipline, respect, physical fitness, and mental toughness. He told Maria that many of his students had been bullied at school, and that proper boxing training had helped them develop the confidence and self-respect they needed to handle difficult situations without resorting to violence. The gym charged $50 per month for unlimited training sessions, which was a significant expense for Maria's tight budget. But she could see the passion in Jimmy's eyes when he talked about helping young people, and she believed that this might be exactly what Marcus needed. She agreed to bring Marcus to the gym the next day after school for a trial session. That evening, Maria sat down with Marcus at the kitchen table and told him about her visit to the boxing gym. Marcus was skeptical at first, worried that learning to fight would only make his problems worse. He had seen movies where the bullied kid learned martial arts and then got into even more trouble for fighting back. But his mother explained that boxing was about much more than fighting, and that it might help him feel better about himself even if he never had to use what he learned. Marcus agreed to try one session at the gym, mostly because he could see how much hope this idea had given. His mother, he didn't want to disappoint her, even though he privately doubted that boxing could solve his problems at school. He was overweight, uncoordinated, and had never been good at any sport. The idea of putting on boxing gloves and trying to hit, things seemed almost ridiculous to him. The next afternoon, Maria picked Marcus up from school and drove him to Murphy's boxing gym. Marcus felt nervous as they walked through the front door, unsure of what to expect. The gym was busy with people of all ages working out, some hitting heavy bags, others jumping rope, and a few sparring in the boxing ring that dominated the center of the room. Jimmy Murphy greeted them warmly and introduced Marcus to some of the other people in the gym. Marcus was surprised to see that many of the members were not the tough, scary fighters he had expected. There were teenagers, middle-aged men and women, and even a few people who looked like they had never been in a fight in their lives. Everyone seemed friendly and supportive, creating an atmosphere that was completely different from the hostile environment at school. Jimmy started Marcus's first session with basic stretching and warm-up exercises. Even these simple movements were challenging for Marcus, who had spent most of his time sitting at home or in classrooms, rather than being physically active. But Jimmy was patient and encouraging, explaining that everyone started at their own level and improved at their own pace. Next, Jimmy taught Marcus how to wrap his hands properly to protect his wrists and knuckles. This seemed like a small thing, but Marcus found something satisfying about the ritual of wrapping his hands, as if he was preparing for something important. Jimmy showed him how to make a proper fist and explained the basic mechanics of throwing a punch, emphasizing that technique was much more important than strength or power. Marcus's first attempts at hitting the heavy bag were awkward and weak, but Jimmy corrected his form patiently and offered constant encouragement. After 30 minutes of basic training, Marcus was exhausted but also exhilarated in a way he had never experienced before. For the first time in months, he had spent time in a place where no one made fun of him or treated him as if he didn't belong. On the drive home, Marcus found himself thinking about the gym and wondering what it would be like to go back. His mother asked him what he thought about the experience, and he surprised himself by saying that he wanted to try it again. Maria smiled and told him that they would find a way to make it work, even if it meant making some sacrifices in their budget. That night, Marcus went to bed feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He still dreaded going to school the next day and facing Tyler Brooks, but now he had something to look forward to afterward. He had no idea that this first step into Murphy's boxing gym would eventually transform not just his body, but his entire sense of who he was and what he was capable of achieving. Marcus began going to Murphy's boxing gym every day after school, and slowly his routine started to change everything about his life. At first, he could barely last 15 minutes without getting completely exhausted, but Jimmy Murphy was patient, and encouraging every step of the way. The old trainer had worked with hundreds of young people over the years, and he recognized that Marcus had something special inside him that just needed to be brought out. The first few weeks were the hardest. Marcus's muscles ached constantly, and he felt clumsy and awkward trying to learn the basic movements that the other gym members seemed to perform effortlessly. His punches were weak and uncoordinated, his footwork was terrible, and he got winded, just from shadow boxing for a few minutes. But Jimmy kept reminding him that boxing was a skill that took time to develop, and that every champion had started exactly where Marcus was starting now. Jimmy designed a special training program for Marcus that focused on building his basic fitness and teaching him proper technique. They started each session with stretching and light cardio work, then moved on to basic punching combinations using focus mitts that Jimmy held up for Marcus to hit. The trainer paid careful attention to Marcus's form, constantly correcting his stance, his hand position, and his breathing technique. The other people at the gym were incredibly supportive and welcoming. There was Carlos, a 19-year-old who had been training for 3 years and was preparing for his first amateur fight. There was Mrs. Johnson, a 45-year-old accountant who had started boxing for fitness and stress relief. There was Tommy, a quiet 16-year-old who had been bullied at his own school and found confidence through boxing training. Everyone at the gym treated Marcus with respect and encouragement, creating an environment that was completely different from what he experienced at school. When he made progress, even small improvements, the other members would notice and offer congratulations. When he struggled with a particular technique, they would offer helpful advice or share stories about their own early difficulties with boxing. Marcus began to look forward to his time at the gym more than anything else in his day. While school remained a daily ordeal of harassment and humiliation, the gym became his sanctuary where he could work on improving himself without fear of being mocked or attacked. He started arriving earlier and staying later, spending every possible moment training and learning. Jimmy taught Marcus that boxing was about much more than just throwing punches. It was about discipline, respect, mental toughness, and controlling your emotions under pressure. He explained that a true boxer never looked for fights outside the gym, but was always prepared to defend himself if absolutely necessary. The goal was to become so confident and strong that others would respect you and leave you alone. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to see changes in his body and his abilities. His stamina improved dramatically, allowing him to train for longer periods without getting exhausted. His punches became more powerful and accurate as he developed proper technique and timing. His footwork became smoother and more coordinated, allowing him to move around the ring with increasing grace and confidence. The physical changes were obvious to Marcus when he looked in the mirror at home. His face was becoming leaner, his shoulders were broader, and his arms were developing visible muscle definition. But more importantly, he was beginning to feel different about himself. The constant anxiety and fear that had dominated his thoughts for months was being replaced by a growing sense of strength and self-confidence. At school, Marcus continued to endure the daily harassment from Tyler Brooks and his friends, but something inside him was changing. He still felt the familiar anger and humiliation when they tormented him, but now he also felt something else, a quiet awareness of his own growing strength and capability. He began to carry himself differently, walking with slightly more confidence and making eye contact with people instead of always looking down at the ground. Tyler and his friends didn't notice these subtle changes at first, but a few of the other students began to see that something was different about Marcus. His teachers noticed that he seemed more focused and attentive in class, and that his grades were improving as his confidence grew. His mother could see the positive changes in his attitude and behavior at home, where he seemed less depressed and more willing to talk about his day. After 2 months of training, Jimmy began teaching Marcus more advanced techniques. They worked on combination punching, defensive movements, and basic sparring drills with other students. Marcus was amazed at how much he had learned and how much his abilities had improved. He could now train for over an hour without getting exhausted, and his punches were becoming genuinely powerful and accurate. The mental benefits of boxing training were just as important as the physical improvements. Marcus was learning to control his emotions and channel his anger into productive activity. When he felt frustrated or upset about something that had happened at school, he would take those feelings to the gym and work them out on the heavy bag or in sparring practice. This helped him develop better emotional regulation and stress management skills. Jimmy often talked to Marcus about the importance of using his growing skills responsibly. He emphasized that boxing was a tool for self-defense and personal development, not a weapon to be used against others. He shared stories about fighters who had let their abilities go to their heads and ended up in serious trouble. And he made sure Marcus understood that true strength came from restraint and wisdom, not from the ability to hurt other people. Marcus took these lessons to heart, understanding that his boxing training was making him not just physically stronger, but also mentally and emotionally more mature. He began to see Tyler Brooks and his friends differently, not as powerful tormentors who controlled his life, but as insecure young people who picked on others to make themselves feel better. This shift in perspective helped him endure their harassment with greater dignity and composure. As Marcus's skills continued to develop, he began to dream about what it might be like to compete in amateur boxing tournaments. Jimmy encouraged these dreams while also emphasizing that competition was just one aspect of boxing, and that the most important benefits came from the daily discipline and training itself. Marcus started to see himself not just as a victim of bullying, but as a boxer in training, someone who was working every day to become the best version of himself. The transformation was happening slowly but steadily, building Marcus's confidence and changing his entire outlook on life. He had no idea that all of this preparation and training would soon be put to the test in a way that would change everything about his situation at school and his reputation among his classmates. 3 months into his boxing training, Marcus had transformed in ways that even he couldn't have imagined when he first walked into Murphy's boxing gym. His body had changed dramatically, losing over 30 pounds of fat while gaining significant muscle mass. His shoulders were broader, his arms were stronger, and his overall fitness level had improved beyond recognition. But more importantly, his confidence and mental toughness had grown to match his physical improvements. Marcus still wore loose-fitting clothes to school that concealed his physical transformation. He preferred to keep his boxing training private, partly because he didn't want to draw additional attention to himself, and partly because Jimmy Murphy had taught him that true strength didn't need to be displayed or bragged about. A confident person didn't need to advertise their abilities to the world. The harassment from Tyler Brooks and his friends continued every day, but Marcus was handling it differently now. Instead of feeling helpless and defeated, he would mentally practice the techniques Jimmy had taught him for controlling his emotions under pressure. He would breathe deeply, stay calm, and remind himself that he was becoming stronger every day while his tormentors remained the same insecure bullies they had always been. At the gym, Marcus had progressed to sparring with other students under Jimmy's careful supervision. These practice sessions taught him how to apply his techniques against a moving opponent while maintaining his composure and defensive awareness. He learned to read his opponent's movements, anticipate their attacks, and respond with precise counterpunches. Most importantly, he learned to stay calm and think clearly even when someone was trying to hit him. Jimmy was impressed with Marcus's progress and dedication. The young man never missed a training session, always arrived early and stayed late, and showed the kind of discipline and commitment that separated serious boxers from casual participants. Jimmy had seen many students come and go over the years, but Marcus had something special, a combination of natural ability, strong work, ethic, and genuine respect for the sport. The other gym members had also noticed Marcus's remarkable improvement. Carlos, the 19-year-old preparing for amateur competition, often complimented Marcus on his technique and power. Mrs. Johnson remarked that Marcus had become one of the most dedicated students she had ever seen at the gym. Tommy, the 16-year-old, who had also been bullied at school, looked up to Marcus as an example of how boxing could change someone's life for the better. Marcus's mother, Maria, was amazed at the positive changes in her son. He was more confident, more talkative at home, and seemed to have found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. His grades had improved significantly as his concentration and focus got better. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely happy for the first time in months, excited about his training and proud of his progress. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Marcus was at his locker organizing his books for first period when Tyler Brooks and his usual group of friends surrounded him. This harassment session was different from the others because Tyler seemed particularly angry about something, and his aggression was more intense than usual. Perhaps he was frustrated that his months of bullying hadn't broken Marcus's spirit the way he had expected. Tyler started with his usual verbal abuse, making cruel comments about Marcus's appearance and family background. But when Marcus didn't react with the fear and humiliation that Tyler was expecting, the older boy decided to escalate the situation. He grabbed Marcus's backpack and dumped its contents across the hallway floor, scattering homework assignments, textbooks, and personal belongings everywhere. A crowd of students gathered to watch the spectacle, some recording with their phones, while others simply enjoyed the entertainment. Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in his chest, but something else was rising too. 3 months of training, discipline, and accumulated confidence. As he bent down to collect his scattered belongings, Tyler kicked him in the ribs, sending him sprawling across the hallway floor. This physical assault crossed a line that changed everything. Marcus had endured months of verbal abuse and minor physical harassment. But this deliberate kick was a direct attack that demanded a response. As he picked himself up from the floor, Marcus felt a calmness descend over him that he had never experienced before. Jimmy's voice echoed in his mind. Control the distance, control the timing, control yourself. Tyler reached down to grab Marcus's shirt, intending to pull him up for another humiliating display in front of the watching crowd. But as Tyler's hand touched Marcus's shirt, the bullied boy made a decision that would change everything. In one fluid motion, Marcus stepped back to create the perfect distance that Jimmy had drilled into him thousands of times during training sessions. Marcus's left hand came up in a textbook jab that caught Tyler completely off guard. The punch was thrown with perfect technique, using the rotation of Marcus's hips and shoulders to generate maximum power while maintaining precise accuracy. Tyler's head snapped back from the impact, his eyes wide with shock and surprise. He had never expected his victim to fight back, let alone with such skill and power. Before Tyler could recover from the first punch, Marcus followed up with a right cross that landed squarely on Tyler's jaw. This second punch was thrown with all the power and technique that Marcus had developed over months of training. Tyler's knees buckled and he stumbled backward, his hands going up to his face as he tried to process what had just happened to him. The hallway erupted in gasps and shouts as the watching students realized what they were witnessing. Marcus stood, in a perfect boxing stance, his hands raised in a defensive position, his breathing calm and controlled. The transformation was complete and undeniable. The quiet, overweight victim had revealed himself to be a skilled fighter who had been hiding his abilities for months. Tyler's friends backed away in shock, suddenly realizing that they had been tormenting someone far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The crowd of watching students pressed closer, their phones capturing every moment of Tyler's humiliation and Marcus's unexpected victory. Within minutes, the video would spread throughout the school, showing everyone that the era of Marcus Williams being anyone's victim had come to a dramatic end. The aftermath of the hallway confrontation spread through Roosevelt High School like wildfire. Within 15 minutes of the incident, the video of Marcus's defensive action against Tyler Brooks was circulating on every social media platform used by the students. The quiet, overweight boy who had been everyone's favorite target for months had revealed himself to be a skilled boxer, capable of defending himself with devastating effectiveness. Principal Johnson arrived at the scene just as the crowd was beginning to disperse. He found Tyler Brooks sitting on the floor, holding his jaw and looking dazed, while Marcus Williams stood nearby with his hands at his sides, completely calm and composed. The contrast between the aggressor's confusion and the victim's serenity told the story more clearly than any witness statement could have provided. Several students immediately came forward to explain what had happened, their accounts consistent and clear about who had initiated the confrontation and escalated it to physical violence. Tyler had dumped Marcus's belongings, kicked him while he was down, and then grabbed his shirt to continue the assault. Marcus had simply defended himself with 2 perfectly executed punches that ended the confrontation immediately. The principal had dealt with Marcus many times before, always as the victim of bullying incidents, never as someone who fought back. This time, however, something was clearly different about the quiet young man standing before him. Marcus showed no signs of anger or aggression, speaking respectfully and honestly about what had happened without trying to make excuses or blame others for the situation. Tyler Brooks was taken to the school nurse to have his injuries examined, while Marcus was escorted to the principal's office to give his statement about the incident. Principal Johnson had to admit that he was impressed by Marcus's composure and maturity in handling the situation. The young man showed genuine concern for Tyler's well-being and expressed regret that the confrontation had escalated to physical violence. The school's investigation into the incident was thorough but straightforward. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Tyler had initiated the confrontation and used physical violence first, while Marcus had only defended himself with reasonable force. The administration had to acknowledge that Marcus had acted within his rights to protect himself from an unprovoked assault. Jimmy Murphy received a phone call from the school that afternoon asking about Marcus's boxing training and character. The old trainer spoke glowingly of his student, emphasizing Marcus's discipline, respect for others, and reluctance to use violence. He explained that Marcus had been taught that fighting was always a last resort, to be used only when absolutely necessary for self-defense. Jimmy also took the opportunity to educate the school administrators about the real purpose of boxing training. He explained that properly taught boxing actually reduced violence by giving young people confidence, discipline, and respect for others. He emphasized that Marcus had shown remarkable restraint in only using enough force to stop the attack without causing serious injury to his aggressor. The reaction from Marcus's fellow students was immediate and dramatic. Students who had never spoken to him before approached with respect and curiosity throughout the rest of the day. Some wanted to know where he had learned to fight. Others simply wanted to be associated with the person who had finally stood up to Tyler Brooks and his crew of bullies. Marcus found himself in the strange position of being popular for the first time in his life, but he handled the attention with the same maturity and humility that had characterized his boxing training. He didn't boast about his victory or seek to intimidate others with his newfound reputation. Instead, he remained the same respectful, quiet person he had always been, just with a new confidence that commanded natural respect. Tyler Brooks faced suspension from school for initiating the confrontation and physically assaulting another student. His friends, suddenly uncertain about their own invulnerability, became much less aggressive toward other potential victims. The incident had shattered their sense of power and control, showing them that their victims might not be as helpless as they had assumed. The ripple effects of the confrontation extended far beyond the immediate participants. Teachers began paying more attention to the bullying that had been occurring under their noses for months. Parents started asking questions about the school's anti-bullying policies and demanding better protection for their children. The administration implemented new supervision policies for hallways and common areas. Most importantly, other students who had been suffering in silence began to find the courage to speak up about their own experiences with bullying. Marcus's example showed them that they didn't have to accept mistreatment as inevitable, and that there were ways to build the confidence and skills needed to protect themselves. Marcus returned to Murphy's boxing gym that afternoon with a mixture of relief and concern. He was glad that the daily harassment was finally over, but he was also worried about whether he had used his training appropriately. Jimmy Murphy listened to the whole story and then reassured Marcus that he had handled the situation perfectly, using only the minimum force necessary to protect himself. The old trainer used the incident as a teaching moment, emphasizing that Marcus's months of training had prepared him not just physically, but mentally and emotionally for the confrontation. The discipline, confidence, and emotional control that Marcus had developed through boxing had been just as important as his technical skills in handling the situation appropriately. Over the following weeks, Marcus's life at school was transformed completely. He no longer dreaded walking through the hallways or eating lunch in the cafeteria. Other students treated him with respect, and many asked him about boxing and how they could start training themselves. Marcus was happy to share information about Murphy's boxing gym and the positive impact that training had made on his life. Marcus continued his boxing training with even greater dedication, knowing that he had proven to himself that he could handle difficult situations with courage and wisdom. He began helping Jimmy train some of the newer students, sharing his own experience of how boxing had transformed his life from victim to confident young man. The incident at Roosevelt High School became a turning point not just for Marcus Williams but for the entire school community. It demonstrated that bullying didn't have to be accepted as normal, that victims could find ways to build confidence and protect themselves, and that sometimes standing up to aggression was the only way to make it stop. Marcus had learned that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the confidence and discipline to protect yourself and others when absolutely necessary.